our talking about what's happened to his children, from disease to hunger. Your final comment.
You have a reality where 9 out of 10 households in North Gaza have gone. You have a reality where 9 of 10 households, according to the World Food Program in North Gaza, have been without food for a whole day and a whole night. Imagine families that have to spend hours or more a day just to be able to get a couple of pieces of bread to feed their family. We're seeing hundreds of bodies pile up a day in airstrikes. We risk seeing that or more in the days ahead if there isn't urgent action by world leaders to end these atrocities.
Omar Shakir of Human Rights Watch, we thank you so much for being with us. And we wrap by saying happy birthday to Renee Feltz.
The viewpoints expressed in this program are the opinions of the people expressing them and are not necessarily those of Fresh Air Incorporated, its staff, or its board of directors.
Hi, this is Al McFarlane, host of the Conversation with Al McFarlane. You're listening to 98.3 FM, KFAI, Minneapolis. I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to the Conversation with Al McFarlane. I'm glad to be here. Glad to have you along as well. Kudos always to KFAI. What a mighty, mighty resource, bringing Amy Goodman and other rich, impactful voices to us every day here in community in Twin Cities. Well, today we promise you our own robust conversation. I believe we're going to deliver on that. Co-hosting with me today is my colleague, Dr. Irma McLaurin. She is the Arts and Education Editor for Inside News, but she's also a phenomenal both public service leader in community, as an anthropologist, as an educator. She was the founding leader of the UROC project in North Minneapolis, the Urban Research Outreach and Engagement Center for University of Minnesota. She's been the president of a Shaw University in North Carolina, and is tenured on several educational institutions. She also heads the Irma McLaurin Archive Project, Black Feminist Archive at University of Massachusetts Amherst. Irma, today we're going to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. First of all, how are you doing?
I am great here in Mobile, Alabama. It's a little colder than usual, but I'm surviving. Yeah.
Okay, good to see you. Let me introduce to you two friends of mine and colleagues of mine that I'm working with. In the spirit of disclosure, I'm interviewing Sherry Sanchez Tibbetts, who is the Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Greater Twin Cities United Way, and interviewing her colleague, Shannon Smith Jones, is Senior Vice President of Community Impact, who oversees the United Way's grant-making strategy and more. I'll describe more as we go along. But I am a board member of the United Way, so I have a relationship with them. And in fact, I'm the incoming board chair. So beginning in 2024, I'll be serving as the chair of the board and working very closely with both of my guests today and with the members of our community, all committed to improving and supporting making our communities livable. Well, first of all, let me say good morning and good afternoon and welcome to Shannon and to Sherry. How are you guys both doing? Welcome to the program.
Hi, Al. Thank you for having us.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay,
Glad
well,
to be here today.
Shannon, let me start with you. You and I go back a bit as well. Your family goes back with my family a long ways as well. So it's always good to talk to you. You've got an impressive set of credentials and family credentials as well. So you oversee the grant-making strategy, the strategic communications partnerships, and the coalition building and systems change with a focus on strengthening what you call connective tissues of the work of United Way, while keeping the voice of the community at the center of everything United Way does. Before joining United Way, you spent 6 years as executive director of Hope Community. I interviewed you in that role a little while back. So impressed then, continue to be impressed today. You've also, well, at Hope Community, you're building community through housing, through organizing, through promoting art and food and leadership development. You've also worked at a variety of local nonprofits, including Urban Homeworks, Sabathani Community Center, and Pillsbury United Communities. You've got a BA from, BS in social work from University of Minnesota, and you're working towards pretty much done with your master's program at Concordia University. You're presently an adjunct professor at the University of Minnesota, Hubert Humphrey School of Public Affairs, and you teach neighborhood revitalization strategies and theories. And you are a North Sider. Grew up here where I am in North Minneapolis. First, talk about your work, your role, the short version of your leadership position at Greater Twin Cities United Way.
Yes, thank you, Al, for the beautiful introduction. So yes, I'm the Senior VP of Community Impact at Greater Twin Cities United Way. And really that work is around grant making. We do multi-year grants for around 88 nonprofits in the 9-county area. And then we also do innovative initiatives. And those innovative initiatives are really around where are some of the gaps in the system where we can use our resources to fill those gaps, kind of set up an infrastructure, and then ease our way out of it so that community can still maintain and hold to those things. In addition to that, we do convenings, and then we also have an advocacy agenda. The advocacy agenda, how I think about it is, how do we extend our impact through advocacy? So if housing is part of that, how do we make sure that the policies and practices in government are going to extend our impact, whether it's through financial or policies that are going to set up our community members for a better tomorrow? And so, and we do that through listening. We do that through being informed through community around what are the things we should be advocating for.
Sherry, let me bring you in to introduce you the same way. As Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion with Greater Twin Cities United Way, you provide strategic day-to-day leadership for DEI initiatives, and you advance partnerships across corporate, community, and tribal spaces. My notes say, Sherry, that you thrive on challenges, you embrace change, and that you are continuously seeking opportunities to push the boundaries of what is possible. Your background includes that you served as a Senior Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the Alzheimer's Association Minnesota North Dakota chapter, where you initiated a Spanish multimedia awareness campaign. You created engagement strategies to address health disparities in African American communities and developed and co-led a national work group focused on tribal engagement. You've got a BA from the University of Texas at Austin and a JD from St. Mary's University School of Law in San Antonio, Texas. You're also certified in nonprofit accounting. And so you were team captain for the Walk to End Alzheimer's, and you're on the board of the Minnesota Humanities Center, and more. It says you are a cardio boxer and a beginning sculptor and an NBA fan. Well, Sherry, I didn't know all of that. Good to know that. Talk about your role and the elevator speech about DEI at Twin Cities United Way.
Thank you, Al, and thank you for that great introduction. I am happy to be here and be part of the conversation. As we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, one thing I want to sort of start us off with is that the United Way is broadly engaged in DEI efforts already. You heard about Shannon's work, you know what we do in the community. So my role is really to take the marathon approach, not the sprint approach to DEI. I look at building strategy, working across all our departments to make sure that we're aligning our work and have developed DEI goals. Right now, I'm working particularly with our advancement team to develop a donor diversification strategy and with finance to create a supplier diversity policy so that we can show up differently in communities that we support already. And then next year, I'm really excited. DEI is going to be hosting a series of community convenings so that we can better align our work in the future. I think of DEI as sort of an internal consultant. Our work focuses internally and externally on systems.
So, Aaron, let me bring you in here. The question we talked about before we started the program, I noticed that there'd been a post from Elon Musk on whether or not DEI should die. We can maybe pull that up if you've got it, Cooper. Here's a report, I think, out of Forbes that includes the post. And Musk is saying, he said the point was to end discrimination, not replace it with different discrimination. What do you think about that, Irma? Talk about that. What's the background on this?
Well, I think it's a diversion, and it's the same kind of strategy or interpretation that was used when affirmative action first came onto the landscape. And that is to talk about reverse racism, which of course is an oxymoron. It doesn't exist. People can have prejudices, but racism requires institutional structures and practices. And so this idea that somehow affirming and practicing equity or practicing affirmative action, which is a corrective to centuries of inequality, is somehow the same thing as white supremacy oppression. It's not. But when you have someone like this who is high profile making these kinds of assertions, people don't dig much deeper than what is said. And that's unfortunate because it really is a misunderstanding of what people are talking about. And I think when we hear from Sherry and Shannon that they will, help us understand, what is exactly DEI in practice? What does it look like? And I'm speaking as someone who was a former chief diversity officer at Teach for America. So I have some thoughts on it, but I'd love to hear what they think.
Let's start right there then, Sherry. That's a good point of departure to have you go back and talk more about what DEI is and what it means in the context of our organization, Greater Twin Cities United Way.
Yeah, thank you, Al, and thank you, Irma, for setting that up. I just kind of want to go back to that tweet. We hear so many people crawling out from underneath spaces claiming that DEI is dead, that it's a form of racism. And that's not the case. That's because they don't understand what DEI is supposed to do. And I think what we're going to see moving forward is we're going to see some people who are bold, like the United Way, who are centered in their values and have determined that creating a workplace and really a community where inclusion, belonging, and accessibility are foremost and centered, we're going to see more bold action around that. There's still going to be some challenges, like Irma mentioned, but I think we're also going to see people really looking at their values, corporations and organizations, and deciding to take those values and translate them into policy and actions moving forward.
So what do you see ahead in 2024? How does it show up inside the work of United Way?
Well, that's a good question. We're in the middle right now of our long-term strategic plan. And what we're really doing is centering our values and equity and creating equity is one of our values, but our mission is to create a Twin Cities where everyone is able to thrive regardless of race, income, or place. And for that, what that means to us is that we're going to continue being bold and we're going to speak boldly and take action to support all our community members. In particular, Shannon's work where we focus on organizations that are BIPOC-led and showing up in our communities in those areas where there are documented disparities that are proven by fact. And I think what it means for us is we're also going to focus on looking at different outcomes and different impacts and different way of measuring. We are going to be a partner with corporations and with community to continue to move forward, to be that place where what comes next for DEI is something that we're co-creating together.
Shannon, let me ask you to take a minute to describe the work of the Community Impact Team at Greater Twin Cities United Way. And what's the plan for 2024 for you? And at the background, in the back of this, I want us to always be thinking about what I perceive and describe as a challenge, a threat in the environment. That's what the Elon Musk attitude that tweet represents. And there is, from my point of view as a communicator, an editor, a threat worth paying attention to. If we fail to, we will find ourselves locked out, pushed back to the margin again, and all the work that we've suffered for and struggled to achieve disregarded and starting over again. So talk about the community impact team and its work. And in the back of your conversation, refer to the importance of really, as Sherry said, standing up, showing up, and being intentional in reflecting the values of DE&I.
Absolutely. Intentionality is a must. Like, as many people know, Minnesota is leading, right, in disparities in terms of our BIPOC community and white communities in turn, everything in education, incarceration, home ownership, wealth. And so there is a huge gap that's living in our community, and we have to be intentional around closing that gap. What that looks like is investing in nonprofits that are intentional about transformative work, right? I'm not thinking like transactional is needed, right? We need to feed people, we need to clothe people, but what are the things that are going to transform lives? And so who's closest to community? How do we support those organizations that are on the ground, that are doing amazing work, and partner with them so that we can give them the tools and equip them, whether it's financially or through our innovation work, that allows them to show up in community in a way that's meaningful. In addition to that, I already talked about the innovation work, but we are also 211 and 988 fall underneath my purview as well, right? And so 211 is the biggest first call for help in the state, which goes beyond our 9 counties, right? So we are connecting with nonprofits across the state around who has the biggest needs and how do we support them and make sure that when people need things, they can find someone to call that is going to connect them with local resources. Sherry spoke about convenings around some of the DEI work. We're also planning on having some some community convenings around some of these gaps, like where the conversations having around incarceration, around being unhoused, around mental health and suicide that are happening, and who are the people that need to be at the table, so that we get these conversations happening and going and bringing that up. Right now, post George Floyd, post COVID, we are seeing something in Minnesota, and those are on ground. They need some resources so that we can move from this like day-to-day struggle and like continue to move up where people are thriving in community. And so we want to be able to resource that work.
And can I just throw in a model, because I think UROC was doing this, 14, 15 years ago. We started with community affairs meetings once a month that the community could come in and ask any question, talk about the issues that were concerned to them, so that we had our ear to the ground before we even had renovated the building. And Makeda Zulu Gillespie, who's now the executive director, was my community coordinator. And the fact that she came from that community, I think, was important and gave us a level of credibility. Juana Jansen was the person who was, sort of working with the university. And ironically, the most opposition came from inside the university. People didn't want to give up power. And I think that's really what is underneath all this, is that we're talking about a redistribution of wealth and power. But there is this idea that somehow it is a finite piece of pie, and that we're all scrambling over these finite pieces when the pie is bigger. There are people in Minnesota, especially, which has one of the wealthiest, given the businesses that have started there, it has tremendous wealth, but it doesn't trickle down, And I think that's some of the critiques that they've gotten when they've gone for funding, is that you have great educational systems, but it's not getting to the people who need it. You have great, resources, but it's not getting to the people who need it. So what does it take to get to the people who need it. And what we did was a community-based research project. And it was looking at the mortgage foreclosure, which has had almost the same impact that COVID and the George Floyd event has had. People were committing suicide, people became unhoused, people became financially, strapped and indigent. And what happened is that most of the resources were focused on financial literacy. As if people were too stupid to understand, what was happening. And sure, there was some financial, elements of illiteracy, but for the most part, people were really duped into believing that these mortgages were going to actually help them. And you had people who were very smart, and I remember that they held a congressional hearing, about the mortgage foreclosure, in which a woman whose husband had founded the NAA, the Urban League, came forward and said, someone from my church approached me to refinance my loan, and I believed them, I trusted them. So a lot of times people were going in, but when we did that study, we met weekly. Anybody could come in and ask questions and learn how to do research methods. We did content analysis of newspapers. And what we found was that North Minneapolis in particular, 56% of all the mortgage foreclosures happened in 3 zip codes in that area. That it's the same thing that had happened previously when we had the other mortgage crunch. And so there's a pattern where certain communities are always impacted adversely. And for me, what it takes is the kind of leadership that you all are demonstrating. My experience has been that DEI cannot be successful if it does not come from the top leadership and if the DEI person is not reporting to the CEO. Anything less than that, it's just a figurehead.
Shannon, jump in here. You mentioned 211. What about 988? What's that project? Just for background. And then, in response to Dr. Irma's comments there, where does the question of culture and race and class enter our work at Greater Twin Cities United Way?
Yeah, thank you so much for all of that, Dr. Irma. As a lifelong Northsider, all of these things resonate with me, and I remember these processes. So 988, to answer your question, Al, is a suicide hotline. And so it was a 1-800 number. We now have gotten that under. We have a strong infrastructure to be able to be a first call for help in many ways. And so this is the number that people call when they are really having a hard time, and for us to be able to talk them through some things until we can maybe give them a warm handoff to someone else or get them through a moment.
And so how did 211 and 988 wind up at Greater Twin Cities United Way? What makes this organization uniquely capable to deliver the responses needed in a responsible way?
Yeah, 211 has been around for a really long time. It precedes me, right? And we had outsourced it for many years and then brought it back in-house. And 211 allows a level of infrastructure and connectivity to community that most organizations do not have. So we have the majority of Minnesota. And if you think about, like, to be able to answer calls for the majority of Minnesotans for a first call for help is huge, right? It gives you day-to-day information around what's happening in what community, who needs what, where are the resources, what's going on. So we get that. That infrastructure allowed us to really be set up as they were trying to systematize and kind of universalize a 988 number here. And we already had the infrastructure and able to be able to do that. So it gives us really good connections in community, and helps us. The 211 and 988 really can kind of work in tandem because of the relationship building that we're able to do in both of those spaces. And we have the infrastructure to be able to do it. You asked an additional question, Alan. I think
I'll come back to it.
Okay.
Speaking your previous remarks, you talked about your connection with some 80 or so community partners. Talk about those relationships, because it seems that what's emerging here is this idea of connectivity, of how we work together and collaborate. And so what is the collaboration strategy? You said that Greater Twin Cities United Way makes grants to some 80 organizations.
Yes.
And is it just handing a check, or is it more than that?
It's more than that. And Dr. Irma said something like around this fighting over resources. I strongly believe there's enough, right? We have enough. And we are all oftentimes fighting for the same things. And so when we can collectively get into the same room and understand that many of our needs are overlapping and that there is enough, that connectivity can allow for those conversations to happen, right? So these 88 relationships or grants, and we call them funded partners and non-funded partners because we believe we have partners in community, whether we are resourcing them or not, are really around one, we give multi-year grants to these. And my predecessor set that up. She did an amazing job doing that because it's really helpful to nonprofits to know we got resources coming next year too, right? It makes it so much easier for those that are on the ground doing the work that we're setting them up like, hey, we know there's still money coming next year. That's one thing that you don't have to worry about. So that sets up organizations for one. We're intentional around making sure that we are funding organizations in the communities that are most needed that tend to be BIPOC communities. So BIPOC led, BIPOC leadership. We're being intentional and bold, as Sherry said, in declaring that and saying this is the way we're going to move. We can be thought partners. Like, what does it look like for us to show up? We can be conveners. These relationships go beyond just writing a check. If people have a question and they're like, hey, I want to understand better this thing, we're asking those questions and we're engaging in those conversations. And then again, one of the things I said earlier, Al, is the convening piece, right? So what are the conversations that need to be had? We are in a situation where we can bring thought leaders together, where we have all these relationships that we can use that skill set that we have and that access to be able to bring meaningful conversations back into community.
I love the idea that you are saying that we are focusing on BIPOC-led as well as BIPOC-serving institutions or partnerships. And the reason I like that, the reason I think it's important, really leads to the question that I ask, and that's about how do we keep conscious about and intentional about culture, about race and class in this important work that we do. Now, I've been a critic and I remain a critic of processes and systems that manage poverty in the Black community. Processes that really, at one level, if the cynic in me is allowed to emerge, will say that there's no intention to solve a problem. There's every intention to keep making money on the problem, right? And so I shout that all the time in the newspaper, and I criticize, and I think it's important that the United Way is saying, and other foundations are now saying, we are intentional and conscious about BIPOC-led or Black-led initiatives. So it's not a question of, and this is the other Al McFarlane-ism I say that we get the misery, they get the money. How do we change that? So that the investment in problem solving is an investment in the problem solving ability in our community, articulated by our community and delivered by our community. And the organization, as you're describing it, is supporting the infrastructure and the capacity, the problem solving capacity of neighborhoods through its organizations. Does that make sense to you?
Absolutely does. And so what you have me thinking around is like our systems, like even means testing or welfare or MFIP, right? It's like this process, or even housing, where you can go so far and then you like fall off a cliff, right? And you're like, you're forced to make these false choices. Do I take a promotion or do I keep my food support? Community members are having to make these decisions that they shouldn't have to make. Right. And so our work is one to like help the organizations that are supporting those community members and family members in that moment. And then also go upstream and look at the policies that are creating what you're talking about, Al, is this like funding of keeping people in a place,
Yeah.
right? And I always ask the question, how many people are getting paid on the backs of poverty? How many people?
A lot.
I know.
A lot.
And how do we get out of the way of saying what people do not need to be involved in this in order for it to get to the people it needs to get to, so that they can make the choices they need to make for their lives? I trust community. I believe in community. I believe community knows what they need. And Dr. Irma, you said earlier something around the financial literacy. There is nobody who knows how to make some money work than a mom who
That's
doesn't
right.
have a whole lot. They are the best financial people I could ever learn under, because they figure it out in a way that is beyond most people's imaginations.
But is not actually acknowledged as such. And I would say, having worked at the Ford Foundation, and I had 59 grantees, and my portfolio was women's studies, Black studies, and research on race, class, and gender. So I got the minority portfolio. Anything that they didn't know what to do with that had to do with race, class, and gender went into my portfolio. And what I found is that as I was learning about navigating, I learned from the guys at Princeton things like, well, if your institution gets the grant, have them put it in an interest-bearing account. They were the ones who told me, write it into our grant so that the interest from that we can then put back into the program. So I started sharing that knowledge. I think one of the things that happens, and the Chronicle of Philanthropy has been pretty, I would say, transparent about the fact that foundations have actually been some of the main purveyors of inequality. They have not funded BIPOC organizations in the same way. They've not given them structural support in terms of operational funding. They've not supported their development in terms of leadership and succession. And so people may do good work, but then once that leader leaves, it kind of falls apart because there wasn't that investment. And I think that it's not just about delivering the programs. It's about leadership development across all stratas so that there is infrastructure in that organization. It's about investing. I remember at Ford, we had something called Vector 3. And it was about how organizations were going to have to document, and they were going to have to, these financial accountings. And I'm like, does anyone see a problem with this, where the people who have the least resources are being asked to do all this extra work, but you're not putting any extra money in for them to do that? If you want, an account, a final report from an accountant, then put some money in so they can hire one, as opposed to asking them to now, as you say, choose between, do we deliver all of this program or do we pay an accountant so that we can meet the needs of the funding agency? So I think there's still some tension in that. And the latest stuff that I've been seeing in the Chronicle is that there's still not funding at the same levels. There's still tremendous disparity, despite all the money that went in. And a lot of it went to organizations that may have served underrepresented communities, but the leadership was not from those communities or didn't look like those communities.
Dr. Irma, you brought us back to a full circle around why DEI is needed. You talked about systems that are set up to disadvantage people. You talked about hidden rules for navigating those systems. And you talked about under-resourced for community organizations. Back to where we started at the very beginning around why that tweet around DEI.
And I would add to that, Sherry, this is where Sherry and I work in tandem well, right? Because what you're talking about, Dr. Irma, is a disinvestment in community. When you talk about, I'm going to continue to fund organizations that have always been funded so that they can build out their leadership pipeline, so they can grow their infrastructure, so they're set up to be responsive when a RFP comes out, and then the ones that don't have the infrastructure, and then we're like, why don't those organizations ever tap in? Well, because they haven't been invested in, right? So that's that work. But the other piece that I feel like you touched on is the how you do it.
Yes.
And the how is investing in your staff, investing in vendor diversity, investing in how you're showing up internally so the internal work is reflecting the external work. And that's how Sherry and I are like, how do we tackle this in a holistic way between both roles?
Well,
I would
and I
say
think
one
part
of the
that,
best,
oh,
sorry, go ahead.
excuse me, there's a little bit of delay. I just to Shannon's point is that if you're effective at doing DEI work, it's not a check the box add on. This is a DEI space over here. It is fully integrated in every way and everything that you're doing, whether it's our investment in community or our development of our staff and our culture internally, as well as how we support community. Dr. Irma?
No,
Please.
I would simply say, we also should not get caught up in terms. I was doing DEI work decades ago, and we didn't call it that. In fact, I have found that sometimes not having DEI in your title is better than having it in, because you then become sort of a target, right? But I was doing leadership in which I had predominantly white staff because I was working in white environments. No one ever told me that, I needed extra help. No one ever said I needed to go to courses. It was, if you're going to be a good leader, you sure as hell better learn how to lead across lines of differences and diversity. And that's what we've done. And I think one of the things I would advocate is coaching for BIPOC nonprofits. They need a sounding board that's not their board, that's outside of that, that's invested in their development. And so I found that has been very successful. And I would say that that's the one gift that the University of Minnesota gave me. It connected me to my consultant who became my coach. And to this day, 13 years later, we're still connected. Every time I moved into a new leadership position, I would call her up because I valued her advice. She believed in me. And I think investing, not in mentoring, because I think mentoring can get kind of fuzzy, but in leadership coaching, and not just at the senior level, but across stratas of the staff, so that as they are developing, they're also getting that support is important.
I think that's a great point, Dr. Irma, that we sometimes don't talk about, is bringing in consultants for nonprofits. In my life before Greater Twin Cities United Way, I was a nonprofit executive director, culturally specific organization focused on serving women who were homeless because of physical and sexual violence and who were Native American. And often we would have consultants come in and they would take a cookie cutter approach and tell us, this is what you need to do. They didn't spend the time to understand our community or the organization's history, or even the extra challenges that sometimes culturally specific and BIPOC-led organizations face. And I think we don't talk enough about that sometimes.
Well, you know what? This is a wonderful conversation. Let me take a break here to say I'm Al McFarlane. You're listening to the Conversation with Al McFarlane. My guests include Sherry Sanchez-Tibbetts, who is a vice president for DE&I at Greater Twin Cities United Way, and Shannon Smith-Jones, senior vice president for community impact at Greater Twin Cities United Way. My co-host today, Dr. Irma McLaurin, who is Insight News's culture and education editor. A great conversation, and one thing that I'm hearing is the question of culture. Sherry, how do we then become the example of creating a culture of belonging that includes, in our case, United Way's case, donor diversification, donor diversity? Shannon, you mentioned supplier diversity, expanding engagement with employees through employee resource groups. And how do we do that with an intention in building relationships and a presence in the community? And it should also include, how do we do that at the board level? My hope is that during the course of my tenure as board chair, we will effectively model both innovation and vision of how we show up internally and externally in our presence and working relationships, but also in the outcomes and how we engage the public and the problems, which we can recast as opportunities for moving community forward. Sherry, what do you think?
I think that's $1 million question, Al. How can we do all that in the next 3 to 5 years? But I think what it starts is recognizing that what we say outwardly and how we model our behavior outwardly needs to be reflected internally within our workplace culture. And right now, the United Way is in the series of action planning. We've done an employee engagement survey. We found some disparities in experience. We've done some breakout groups and focus opportunities with some of our leadership teams. This week, we are in the midst of focus groups for all staff to talk about inclusion and trust and what that looks like in an organization. And I think the first step is admitting that we need to make sure that our alignment is the same internally and externally.
Mm-hmm. Shannon, jump on there.
Yeah, I think how we do it is being honest and being reflective, right? And then being able to have the hard conversations. Minnesota Nice isn't going to work, right? We have to be able to say, this was an issue. How are we going to address it? If we are saying this, how are we demonstrating this? And so I agree with you, Al. I want us to be able to say, this is what it looks like to lead this way, to lead boldly this way. And that means we're not always going to get it right. That means we're going to have someone say something to us sometimes, and we have to be open to hearing it and being able to say, now let's go back and figure out how we need to continue into this dialogue with community and with each other. But to Sherry's point, this should be integrated in it should be part of the DNA. It should be so part of the way that we do our work that nobody feels threatened about the work we're doing because they're included in it. And, when we exclude folks or they feel excluded, that's where there's this the scarcity model comes into play. And there truly is enough. And we just need to be vulnerable enough to say we don't always get it right. And the work is iterative. And this was our best thinking today. And then tomorrow we're going to take what we heard and we're going to apply that feedback and we're going to do it again. And we're going to keep trying it. And we're going to keep readjusting as the world changes, as we learn, as community shifts, because nothing is static, right? The one thing that's constant is change. And we have to be able to be adaptable to that.
A woman after my own heart, Shannon. I study change processing.
Let me ask you, Irma, then, given we started with the Elon Musk tweet, so there is definitely a countervailing force or wind, Donald Trump, and the Trump denial or the Make America Great. There's a movement to strip away, to step back from what you and I would have called progressive and moving towards a fair and equitable society and culture. So how does an organization like Greater Twin Cities United Way steel itself is the right word, I think, maybe, or fortify its intention so that it can move, as Sherry said, boldly in an environment that sometimes has big voices and big sounds questioning the value of the direction and of the objectives that we say we seek to achieve. What do you think, Dr. Irma?
Well, I would say that we should not get distracted by the Donald Trumps or the Elon Musk, because this pattern began way before them, before they came on the horizon. Back in 2014, 2015, 2016, when I was at Teach for America, I started identifying what I called white vulnerability. That was before the term white fragility came on. And it was this sense of me too. Well, you've done all these things for people who've been excluded. What about me? And I called it the reclamation of whiteness. And I think that's what Donald Trump represents, this sense of white entitlement that people feel that they should have just automatically, and a resentment about the fact that other groups are now being forefronted. It doesn't mean that they've had anything taken away from them, but it means that other people are getting shares that historically have been not there. And I think we have to not get distracted by either terminology or by individual personalities, and really look at the issue. And that means looking at patterns. And sometimes organizations can't see that. you really can't assess yourself. It sounds good, but it's like a fish living in the ocean. It doesn't know it's swimming in water and that it's that big. So sometimes you need outside people to come in and identify, here's some patterns. And I'll give you an example of an organization where 70% of its staff were women, but 99% of the senior people, that it had were men. And I was like, you have a contradiction here. What is going on? And and nobody said there was a gender problem. How is that possible? Because they couldn't see it. It had become so normalized. So I think having people who can help you see what are sort of normative patterns that may be getting in the way. I have this, I don't know if Cooper can bring it up, but I have this saying that I have, which is, you change hearts, you change minds, change behavior. And I would add to that, change policies to achieve transformation. You got to start with people being willing to change. Then you give them the information that they need. Then you hope that those two things will lead to change behavior. But I would also say, as organizations, you also have to change policies and practices. And then we're talking about transformation. It takes all of this, to make it work.
How Shannon, different is philanthropy now from what we and you knew growing up? When you were a kid in North Minneapolis, for example, and heard about philanthropy, your family's been involved in all kinds of ways over the years, but what was the perception of the role of the philanthropist and that philanthropist relationship with the community? And how has that changed? Is it changing?
It's really interesting because I feel like philanthropy, as I've gotten older, I think about it in two ways, right? I think about this, what it felt like white charitable philanthropy, right? Where like folks came into your community, they observed your community, they handed out things, and then they like did the food, food shelves and, did their good deed for the day and then left, right? That has evolved in that space of like, this is not charity, right? This is us being in relationship with community and figuring out how to resource the things that are needed. And that it goes beyond just serving folks for a day. But the other piece that we often don't think about or talk about as much is I grew up with philanthropy. I grew up in a Black church.
That's right.
I grew up going to Zion Baptist Church, and that was philanthropy every day, right? And there was just a conversation with Shonda where she was talking about this, where the philanthropy was you got money from your mom and you gave it into the church. And so like community always had an internal infrastructure of philanthropy. We just never called it that, right? Like community members showing up to help build a wall, or community members coming over to, when something happened in the family and everybody came and brought their resources together around it. It was philanthropy, but we didn't call it that, right? We called it being in community with one another. And that's what you did. And so there's like this white structure that feels like philanthropy of like a transactional charity model that I would say philanthropy is trying to move away from and trying to, we are trying to move into a way of where we're equipping a community. They have the answers that they need, and they just need tools sometimes in order to do the things that they know they need. And so how do we resource that work? And I think about it differently than us saying, we know what you need and we're going to come in and do it for you. Like, no, we're actually just going to equip you so that you all can do it. And we can do it in partnership, or we can just help equip you. And I think that's kind of where it's moving to.
And I think the main thing is that people need to be listened to, that they need to be asked, and not assume that just because there seems to be this desperate need over here, that's really what people want. They may want something else that will enable them to get to addressing that, but we have to listen to them first.
We have to listen to them, and we have to recognize that all our communities have strengths within them that we can capitalize on. We talk about asset building, but sometimes the informal network Shannon was talking about, that collective giving, is present in so many of our communities that we forget about it sometimes.
And I would say Ford did, Lynetta Gilbert, my colleague, who is a senior program officer, she did a whole study on Black philanthropy. And I think,
Mhm.
as you indicated, Shannon, there's a misnomer in the philanthropy field. And so, one, we don't find many Black folk in or Indigenous people in development because the perception is that we can't talk to white donors with lots of money. That's one misnomer. And the second is that Black folks don't give money. And of course, that's not true. And as you pointed out, there are all kinds of ways. I know that churches that helped rebuild after Katrina, I know that there are organizations in Texas that had like an AIDS, they took over a shopping center and turned it into a residence for people with HIV/AIDS. We don't talk about those things because they're not headliners. And I think one is that organizations like you all could do a better job of showcasing what are the gifts and the talents that the community is actually giving. And that was one thing that UROC tried to do, was to lift up Northside and tell its story in such a way that people would actually recognize its assets.
Let me ask Sherry and Shannon to take a minute to talk about your personal story. I gave a little bit about your background in the opening from your bio, but on the personal side, Sherry, if I ask you, who is Sherry Sanchez Tibbetts? What's your mission in life? Why are you here? How do you respond to that briefly?
The first thing I'm going to say is that I'm a Texas girl living in Minnesota. And so that gives me a different perspective on things. I did not hear words like internalized oppression until I moved to Minnesota. And I didn't see how some systems didn't work until I moved to Minnesota. So my personal mission is to make sure that systems, whether they're education, higher ed, healthcare, or philanthropy, where I'm at now, work well for everyone.
What's your family background? Who's your mom and your dad and your grands, and how do they
How much time do
show
you
up
have,
in your
Al?
life?
My family's right behind me. You can see their pictures. They got my back, literally and figuratively. My mom, it was a single parent who raised me and my brothers and sisters, was a strong value of family, faith, and relying on your people. That those are the only ones you can count on. Historically, my family is Native American, Mexican, Comanche, and Spanish. And one of the things that has always instilled in me is my grandfather told me growing up, don't back down from a fight. You don't have to win, but you don't have to, but you have to stand up for yourself. And to put that in context, my grandfather grew up in West Texas, seeing signs that said no blacks, no Indians, but dogs welcome.
And some of those signs are still there, like in South Dakota. They're still there.
And some of the attitudes are still there. The signs are not.
That's right. Shannon, what's your family story? I've mentioned your family several times, but I want you to talk about who Shannon Smith Jones is and whose shoulders you stand on. What's who do you see yourself as the extension of through genealogy and culture?
Yeah, well, I'm Larry and Terry Ann's daughter. First and foremost, my uncle was Dr. Richard Green, was the first Black superintendent in Minneapolis. I have family on my mom's side, Harry Davis. My Aunt Gladys was a social worker at Phyllis Wheatley in Minneapolis. My sister is Shonda Smith Baker, Conversations with Shonda. I grew up. Both of my grandmothers were deeply rooted in the church. My grandma Petta Ford was a Sunday school teacher. So there is like this sense of this is what you do, either by career choice or what you do outside of work, right? You show up for a community, you do the work, you challenge systems, you don't accept status quo. You educate yourself, you seek knowledge. So like all of these things, and it was so normalized to engage in these dialogues and engage in community in this way, that I believe that those shoulders that I stand on it is my responsibility, right? It's my responsibility to do it. Again, whether it's through my work or whether it's in my spare time, that it's my responsibility to make sure that the children are okay, that the elders are okay, that we are looking out for one another, and that I'm using what I have access to make sure that the people around me can do better because of something that I did, right? So like you always leave a place better than how you found it. And I believe those are the shoulders that I'm standing on, and I don't want to disappoint, right? Like, fourth generation, me and my sister, fourth generation Northsider, me and my sister raised fifth generation. There's a sixth generation around here somewhere. My sisters. And so like, we have a legacy in the work, but we also have a responsibility.
That's wonderful. And so, Sherry and Shannon, let's recap. How does this legacy that's in you, that you are, show up in the workplace at Greater Twin Cities United Way? Because it sounds like being yourself, things are going to be a certain way, because that's what and who you are. Does that make sense?
It absolutely makes sense. So I bring my full self to the table, right? I'm going to ask the questions. I'm going to challenge not just myself, but I'm going to challenge our colleagues. I'm going to challenge, why is this thing this way? Why are we doing it this way? Have we thought about it? Have we, and I'm curious. So I don't try to lead with assumptions, but really lead in curiosity of like, it might be there for a reason. It might make sense, or it might not. Right. But if we're going to do this work and this is what we say we're about, we gotta be about it. And so that's how it shows up in the work of being always just authentically who I am, asking the questions and doing the things that I do. I don't know how to not be me, right? So like, all the spaces I'm in, that's what you're going to get.
Sherry, what are your thoughts on the same question?
I think about my family and the responsibility I have to make things better. Our small corner, wherever we live, it's part of what I grew up believing. And I also grew up believing, because my grandfather instilled this in me, that you can do whatever you want to do. And not every system allows you to do that. So it's my responsibility to knock some of those walls down.
Irma, what do you think? What are your thoughts as you hear? Yeah.
I hear, responsibility. I hear, commitment. I hear community. I hear legacy. And I think all of those are important. I think for me, the question is, are those values being transmitted? Does the next generation? And if not, how do we cultivate that? I think there has been such an upsurgence or resurgence of what Bella and Bella in Habits of the Heart called radical individualism, where people are so inwardly focused. And I think we have to find a way to break that so that people get back to those very things that both Shannon and Sherry talked about, which is that whatever we do has a collective impact, that it's not just what is our individual behavior, but that behavior actually has ramifications, for the people around us, the communities that we come from. And so it means that how we show up is critical, and how we have impact is critical, because it's not just about us. So to be of service, that's something that I've always felt very strongly about in all my work, is to make sure that, one, I was never the only one. Oftentimes, I'm a segregationist baby, so I grew up in segregation, but I always never wanted to be the only one, even though often I was. But to try and find ways to open the way for others to come behind me. Absolutely.
Thank you, Irma. Great program, great conversation, Sherry and Shannon. Let's keep this conversation going. I especially want to use this platform to elevate the work of our partners in community. I'm Al McFarlane. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.